So without further ado, turn it over to Dr. Jamie Ward from the University of Sussex, who's going to tell us a little bit more about some of the questions this morning, actually. What sounds are associated with misophonia?
Thank you, Sylvie. So first of all, who I am. So I'm a university professor with an expertise in brain and behavior. I'm in a psychology department. I'm not a therapist and I'm not a mind reader. I don't have misophonia myself, but I come to this with a long history of studying people with sensory differences. So autism, synesthesia, various other things like this. I'm not making any money out of misophonia or commercializing anything I'm talking about today. And this is where I live and work. That is my house in the middle, but I would love to live there. But that is in Brighton, should you ever come and visit the south coast of England. So what sounds trigger misophonia? Well, there are multiple ways of asking this question. One is you can just simply ask people with free text and then just put it in a word cloud. And this is what we have here from 120 misophonics. Maybe you can recognize some of your own triggers here. And some of them we've obviously heard about today, chewing, eating, breathing, crunching, and so on. But within this, you can take pairs of people who might give you somewhat different answers to this. So on the left here, this person saying, I can't stand it when my sister chews. Whereas this guy says, for me, I hate tapping and typing. So on the surface, these look like different people. They don't seem to have sounds in common, even though we would give them the label misophonia. But is that really true? And also, is it true that the sounds people tell you about are the only ones that they dislike? Maybe if we give this lady an actual sound of tapping and typing, she would say, yeah, I really don't like this as well. So the question is how we measure this. There have been some studies with brain imaging where they present people with misophonia with sounds and shown actually that they have much greater activation for their trigger sounds and not much different from for other sounds. So this kind of implies that maybe it's only some sounds that are affected and others aren't. Today, I'll kind of challenge that and actually argue that most sounds seem to participate in misophonia to a greater or lesser extent. So our research was motivated by a couple of previous studies, this one by Edelstein et al. And what they did is they played misophonics and controls a bunch of sounds, and in this case, just to rate how aversive they are. The blue line shows you what you would expect if misophonics controls rate of the sounds to be equally aversive. So you can see that there are some sounds that lie on the line. That means that they're equally liked or disliked by both groups. The ones above the line are more disliked by misophonics than controls. You can see that's the vast majority of sounds. Up here, we've got what I would call the usual suspects. So the opening a bag of chips, the gum chewing, and so which are really disliked by the misophonics. But actually, my interpretation of this is that misophonics don't like many sounds. There was actually only one sound below the diagonal, and that was rainfall, but I'm not sure it does belong there. We included it as one of our stimuli. So here it's showing that controls dislike rainfall more than misophonics. I'm not sure about that. This was another study by Hansen et al. And they asked misophonics two questions. One is how unpleasant are the sounds and how much discomfort does it give you? So again, these are actual sounds that are played to misophonics. And they came from various categories. So here we've got, again, some of the usual suspects, human-produced oral nasal, with chewing sounds, and then non-oral nasal might be things like tapping, and then here you've got sounds of nature. So for sure, misophonics dislike the human-based oral nasal, but people without misophonia dislike these somewhat as well. But misophonics differ in all of these categories. Misophonics get higher ratings no matter what the sound. So this was the impetus to our study. And we were inspired by the Hansen et al. We included their three categories here. And we also had another category, which were basically standard misophonic triggers, but we rearranged the sound files just by jumbling them up, if you will, so nobody could tell what these were. So it was things like chewing, but distorted. So if you ask somebody, what is this? They'll go, I don't know. What we also did is that whereas other people ask about one or two things, we asked about 17 things. So pain, rage, disgust, visual experiences, annoyance, discomfort, too loud. So we have 17 different descriptions and 32 sounds. The other thing that we did is that we tried to use machine learning to try and figure out what it is that makes a misophonic a misophonic. So let me describe this method to you. So we have a bunch of people, over 400 in this study, some with misophonia, some without. We play them the sounds, and people have the slider where they just tell us what they make of these sounds. What we then have is, in effect, something that you could draw as a heat map. So we've got our 32 sounds, our 17 responses, and red coming out means that misophonics are really rating those more strongly. And what we're trying to do is use AI, artificial intelligence, to recognize this pattern and say, based on this pattern, we think you've got misophonia, or we think you don't have misophonia. That's essentially what we're doing here. We're using this using a pattern rather than a single response, and we're trying to predict who has misophonia. So this is indeed the pattern here that we've got. So red means that misophonics rate it more strongly. So things like crunching chips, apple crunch, and so on are really coming out as being strong here. So we've got our 32 sounds here, and I've just ranked them from the most kind of misophonic to the least. What we find is that if we apply our kind of machine learning for each and every sound, that 30 out of the 32 sounds, we can tell who's misophonic or not above chance. Some of them, the performance isn't great. So chance is 0.5, it's somewhat above 0.5, but it is statistically significantly above that. And this would include things like rainfall, but also some of our scramble sounds. So sounds that people can't tell what it is, misophonics are still rating them. If we look at the pattern as a whole, so we just have a machine learning classifier that effectively takes this bunch of numbers, we can tell who's a misophonic or not with what was called an area under the curve of 0.95. So 1 would be perfect, 0.5 would be chance here. People who say that they've got more clinically severe misophonia on questionnaires are easier to classify with this method. So it is picking out clinical severity, even though we're not asking about that. We're just asking people to rate a bunch of sounds. There are a few surprises here as well. So what does it mean to be blue here? What this means is that people without misophonia give higher ratings. So here we've got visual experiences. So when somebody without misophonia is listening to these sounds, they're saying, I'm visualizing this thing. Whereas with somebody with misophonia, they are not visualizing the thing that is creating the sounds. And again, that's an interesting thing that maybe we could think about in terms of treatment or strategies. The other thing we can do here is a kind of a neat thing, because one of the things we did is that for each of these sounds, we developed a separate machine learning algorithm. So here we would take the ratings to apple crunch. We would have a machine learning algorithm that recognizes those ratings and that spits out a classification accuracy that tells you who's misophonic. And we do the same with typing sounds and a separate classifier for this that gives you an answer. So the asterisk means this is above chance. So all three of these machine learning algorithms and sounds can perform well. But we can do something called cross classification. What this means is that we can take ratings that people gave when they listened to scrambled basketball, and we can feed that through separate machine learning classifiers and show that actually something trained to detect misophonia from an apple crunch can also detect the presence of misophonia from basketball ratings, and similarly for typing and for pretty much most other combinations. So what this means is that misophonics are alike, that you can tell one misophonic from the ratings of another misophonic, but also their ratings to sounds are similar. You can take the ratings from apples and apply that to a whole other sound, and you can predict who's a misophonic in this way. So there is some generality, some common profile that maybe is unexpected if you take the one person saying, I hate this, another person saying, I hate that. And it makes you wonder, well, actually, are we studying misophonia at all? If people dislike most of the sounds you give them, is this misophonia, or are we studying something else? So this term hyperacusis has come up a few times today. This is one definition of hyperacusis from a scoping review. So this is when everyday sounds feel overwhelming, loud, intense, or painful that do not bother other people in the same way. The standard way of thinking about this is that hyperacusis involves many trigger sounds, whereas misophonia is only for very specific sounds. And maybe they've got different kinds of responses in terms of whether they're an emotional or more sensory response, or whether they're related to the loudness or the meaning. In our data, we actually had this statement here. We asked people whether they agreed with it or not. So we just gave them this and said, does that apply to you or doesn't it? Some of our misophonics said, yep, this is me. I have hyperacusis. This is what it's like, presumably as well as misophonia. And some said that they didn't. What we could then do is we could then divide our data set up and look at those misophonics with hyperacusis and misophonics without hyperacusis and see whether they're the same or different. So here, this is just the same kind of data set, just looking at high versus low hyperacusis, just whether or not you go to one end of this line or the other. And without kind of going to the pattern in detail, you can see it looks different. So the sounds that really bothered misophonics are not bothering people with hyperacusis. It looks kind of pink all over, which means that these people are kind of disliking everything to some degree. They're reporting things like a lot of body tension, flinching. But there are some sounds that, again, we can use machine learning to really figure out who within misophonia has hyperacusis. And these are the kinds of sounds that go with that. It's typing, tapping, whether it's scrambled or not scrambled. So again, it doesn't matter whether you can identify the sounds or not. And a lot of these sounds aren't typically loud sounds. If you think about typing, it's that loud. We also went back to our previous data where we simply just had a trigger list and people just ticked off whether this applied to them. So on this axis just tells you how many of the sample agreed with it. So all of these people have misophonia, but some have hyperacusis on top and some don't. Those with pure misophonia, so misophonia without hyperacusis, report a lot more lip smacking, swallowing, and chewing as their most triggering sounds. Those with misophonia and hyperacusis on this end, they've got things like house and car alarms, car engines, repetitive barking, but sirens, but things like rustling plastic and typing, again, comes out as being linked more with hyperacusis or hyperacusis with misophonia as a cluster item. So far I've suggested that misophonia isn't just linked to the specific triggers, to these usual suspects. I've suggested it involves a wide range of sounds to a greater or less extent. But actually it doesn't stop there. People with misophonia are sensitive to a whole range of things. So in another study, we've given both children and adults questionnaires that ask about hypersensitivity to smell, to touch, to lights, and find that misophonics are hypersensitive to many of these things. We have a test that involves what's called visual stress. So this is the British op artist Bridget Riley, who did these kind of black and white lines. And again, some people find this highly aversive. It's not going to cause you any problems to look at this, but some people really don't like it. People with more severe misophonia, so those are the more extreme ends, really find these visual patterns aversive. If you ask people with misophonia whether they have migraine, they do have migraine, but specifically migraine with aura, and particularly those with severe misophonia. So here we've got three groups, people who would not be classified as misophonia. And those in blue and green would both meet a conventional cutoff. They would be clinically significant misophonia. But it's only those at the really high end who are reporting migraine on top of their misophonia. I'm not suggesting that misophonia causes migraine or that migraine causes misophonia, but what we can think about is that there is a broad profile of what it is to be misophonic that's centered around sensory sensitivity and that manifests itself mainly around sounds, but not exclusively around sounds, and can give rise to other kinds of clinical comorbidities. So to summarize, misophonia presents a common pattern both across sounds and people, despite superficial variation from person to person. And this is really important for thinking about the cause of misophonia, because if misophonia is really like one person has triggers A, B, and C, and another person has triggers D, E, and F, it implies that maybe it's something in their environment that they've encountered. Whereas if misophonics agree about what sounds they dislike, this perhaps points to other kinds of mechanisms. Misophonia is not the same as hyperacusis. These seem to have different profiles, and I'm not sure that hyperacusis is just to do with loudness, although that probably is one factor. Misophonia is not all about sounds, even though we define it that way. And then as a more general point, we can apply machine learning to the sound response profile of misophonia. And this is very accurate. And this is, I think, important for as an alternative way of diagnosing misophonia, because if we only diagnose misophonia by clinical severity, then maybe we've got people with misophonia who don't need treatment and people who do. And this is important scientifically to know what misophonia is, as well as how we want to treat it. So this is the core members of our team. You can go to our website, you can volunteer there. We've got fact sheets, we've got other kinds of information. You can find our papers there. So thank you so much.
Great job, Jamie. Thank you, Dr. Ward. We have a couple of questions that have come in, and maybe I can kick us off. The first one is, I'm looking up here at them, based on your research and knowledge, would you agree with, this is how Dr. Gregory characterized things this morning, would you agree with the 3 dimensions of trigger intensity, those being eating, breathing/throat, environment, which were mentioned by Dr. Gregory, or do you consider different or extended dimensions of sound ratings, and why?
Yeah, I listened to that and was wondering if I agree. I'm not sure that I do agree, and certainly people do differ. What we find is that the more severe your misophonia, the more triggers you have. If you give people a list of 40 or 50 possible sounds, the more severe people tick more of those boxes. So there is a link between severity and the overall number of sounds. And I think it's almost if there are some sounds that kind of everybody has, and then the more severe, the more likely they are to go to the whole pool. I think that is something that happens. I think that there are more subtle things going on here. I think that the typing, the tapping, and those things are a slightly different category to the chewing. And I think that would also play out in terms of maybe the acoustic properties, in terms of some having a very clear kind of rhythmic bang, bang, bang when you're typing and tapping, that might have a somewhat different causal mechanism. So I'm in partial agreement, but I don't think it's clear cut.
That's a great point. You noted that misophonia versus hyperacusis is related to sound meaning. This is such an area of active research. Could you explain a little bit further what that means in your work?
So the idea behind sound meaning, and there is good evidence with this, is that if you know what the sound is, or you believe the sound to be chewing, even if it isn't chewing, it is going to sound a lot worse. So that's what I mean by sound meaning, is that it depends on your ability to identify that. If the sound's a bit ambiguous and you believe it's chewing, it's going to sound a lot worse than if you've got the same sound if you don't believe it is. And people have done that by presenting sounds with videos. You'll hear a talk about that later, or just kind of biasing the context. And I think what some people have concluded by that is that misophonia is caused by the context. And that is one possibility. What I'm saying is something different. I think that misophonia is caused by a generic sensory sensitivity. And what context does, it's like a dial that kind of dials it up and takes it to another level. So I would say that the sound meaning of the context is not causing misophonia. It is a very key part. It's worthy of study. It's an important thing to look at, but I see it as somewhat different. Whereas some people might say, no, it is only your interpretation of it that is giving rise to its aversiveness. And I'm not entirely convinced about that.
Well, if misophonia is not related to sounds only, or to specific sounds related to eating, mouth, nose, or throat, do you have suggestions on how we should label it? Is it perhaps part of a broader, more dimensional spectrum of problems? And if so, what could we call that spectrum?
I don't have a problem with calling misophonia in that sense. I don't think that it requires this. I think what we have to think about is that we could think of misophonia as a symptom within a broader range of other things that it tends to go hand in hand with. That doesn't mean that we throw away a definition or a kind of core idea about what misophonia is. It just means that we have to think about it more broadly, or perhaps linking back to the genetic talk for those people who were there, we could imagine that there are a broad set of causes or dispositions towards misophonia. And these dispositions take you down the route of developing misophonia, but they could take you down other routes. They could take you down the route of, greater attention to detail or picking up on other sensory things that other people don't notice, maybe perfectionism, maybe personality traits. So these might all go with misophonia, but it doesn't mean that I want to define misophonia as a personality trait. Misophonia is significant disruption to one's life with sounds. I'm happy with that kind of approach, but it doesn't mean that that is the cause of misophonia is a very narrowly defined box. There could be multiple factors that are giving rise to that particular symptom.
Well, somewhat of a related question, then, what do you think are some of the key implications of your work for clinical psychologists and for patients suffering from misophonia?
I didn't present this today, although I alluded to it. And one of the things that we've looked at is, again, to think about misophonia as having a spectrum, but a spectrum in terms of severity. I mentioned it a little bit in terms of the migraine here. So if I'd have just looked at misophonics and looked at the migraine thing, maybe it wouldn't be significant, because actually at least half of our misophonics don't have anything like this. It's only as you go up to the really upper ends of the misophonia spectrum that you start to see these things going in. So for me, I think what we want to do is that, yes, there might be some cut point where you say above that you've got misophonia and below it you don't. But above the cut point of having misophonia, maybe there's 2 or 3 other cuts as well that actually matter and that give rise to a broader profile of what we call comorbidities, so anxiety, migraine, other things. And maybe this is pointing to other mechanisms, that misophonia is what it is, but then other things start to take it to the next level. You could imagine several transition points along this misophonia spectrum. And I suppose what this sensory thing, this kind of machine learning does, is it tells you where you are on the spectrum just by getting you to rate the sounds. Whether or not it's ruining your life, you can't tell from this, because all you're doing is presented with a bunch of sounds and saying whether you dislike them. But that is still important information in terms of categorizing where you are and where you lie on this.
So do you see a future in which the findings from your work could translate into helping diagnose people with misophonia, where they could be used to predict, like, if someone were to develop it, or when someone would convert from subclinical to clinical, for example?
Yep, I think it probably could. I mean, we know basically this kind of approach is as diagnostically accurate as questionnaires. Whether it's as valid, the pros and cons are, we can debate. I would say that this kind of approach, you don't have to translate. It's not questions. You haven't got to translate them into other languages. Essentially, you've got 17 words that you just slide a rater on. So it's absolutely minimal translation to other cultures. So in that sense, it is a kind of a culture fair test of misophonia. I can't remember what the other parts of the question are. In terms of the transition point, yeah, maybe you can. I think the question is how you would define that in the first place. So in order to, the whole point about this research is it's slightly circular. So you're training this machine learning to classify people who do and don't have misophonia. But how does it know that? And it's because I tell it, because I've given them a questionnaire. So ultimately, it all comes back a little bit to how we choose to define and operationalize these definitions.
It's a very important point. A flurry of questions. Let me make sure that I've captured them all. Are we correct to assume misophonia is encompassing of other things in all cases? Or have there been cases where an individual would only have misophonia? This is getting to some of the comorbidities that you spoke about.
That's a good question. So we divided our misophonics up in various studies into what I called moderate and severe, and others like the Amsterdam scale have used the same kind of taxonomy. We find those with moderate misophonia don't have much else going on outside sounds. They do show a trend for other things, but it's by no means of the same magnitude. So for whatever reason, I think you can have relatively isolated misophonia, and I say relatively rather than perhaps exclusively. I suspect that there are other things going on in the other senses. But I think as those with more extreme misophonia, I'm less sure that these people have it only for sounds, is my what our data is showing.
Okay, we're at about 10 minutes.
Thanks, Chris. Can you desensitize to sounds?
You should be able to, but I think the whole kind of reports of misophonics is that if they did, then listening to somebody chewing or making the worst sound should stop it going away. And, you know, I don't have misophonia, but what everybody tells me is, that doesn't work. So I think it is an interesting question. Again, the kinds of things that people have tried to do is to disguise the sound, and I think that is somewhat promising. I think there is a role of attention to the sound. There's the role of expectation to the sound that again is like a volume switch on your misophonia, if you will. The other things that I was interested in our research is the fact that when misophonics listen to sounds, they don't report visualizing what is making the sound. And that's perhaps something that you could ask misophonics to train themselves to do. It might be that misophonics just aren't good visualizers, but I don't think that is the case. There's another study actually done by the Amsterdam group that when they were playing sounds in an MRI scanner to people with misophonia, they had less visual activity when listening to sounds. So it implies that when they're listening to sounds, they're not thinking about the visual aspects of the source. Maybe their misophonics are just thinking about their own kind of reactions and so on. So again, there's these kind of regulation, attentional strategies, what it is you're paying attention to, how you're thinking about the sound. But ultimately, I think it does come down to a core sound sensitivity.
Well, speaking to the attention piece a little bit, here's a question. When scrambling the audio with distortion, would the distortion add a misophonia-inducing effect on the audio? Oh, this is a great question. It wasn't the one I thought I was asking. Carry on. Could you go into more detail as to whether you reordered the sound at all? So when scrambling the audio with distortion, would the distortion add a misophonia-inducing effect on the audio? Could you go into more detail as to whether you reordered the sound at all?
Yeah, basically it was just a MATLAB kind of package that effectively, if you imagine a sound file, you take little snippets and you reorder them in this. So it has roughly the same frequency profile with this. There are other ways of doing it. Whether we did it the right way or the wrong way, we don't know. All we wanted to do is just disguise what the sound is. And that did work. People did not know what the sound was that they were listening to. One thing that was curious is that we've given these sounds to people who have ASMR and they love them. People with misophonia don't like them. We've not found any sounds that people with misophonia like. They do not like the scrambled sounds. They dislike them. They don't dislike them as intensely as the other sounds. People with ASMR really like these sounds.
You may have partly answered this, but I just want to make sure that I answer this participant's question. With the scrambling technique you use to make the sound unrecognizable to the user, how can you be sure that they wouldn't know what the sound's original material was?
I think that's a good point. I mean, in general, we gave them to a separate sample of people and found that the accuracy of recognizing was less than 10%. And for our other sounds, it was kind of higher than 80–90%. So it might be that some people recognize some sounds. Whether or not that would be enough to distort data, I don't believe it would. I think that this whole, whether you can recognize the sounds or not, I do think it's an important question. I think we did enough to make them unrecognizable, but I think it's a really interesting area of research.
I think we have some sound aficionados with us. Here's another question about the technical. What recording methods did you use to record the apple crunch sound? Did you find certain microphones or distance to the audio source have an impact on the severity of the misophonia for the person experiencing it?
The recording of the sounds were actual free sound websites. So we were, we based this on the previous studies by Heather Hansen and, sorry, I forgot the other name, Ron Koursarou group in Amsterdam. So they were off-the-shelf sound clips that we used here. Now the question is, how did misophonics listen to the sounds? And because it's done online, we don't really have the control of that. We asked them to play it as loud as they can without it being uncomfortable and to keep it at a fixed volume. But it wasn't something that was experimentally controlled because of the nature of it. It would be important to look at this for sure. Yeah, but they were told to listen to it through headphones and to have it as loud as they could without it being uncomfortable.
To take these next two out of order, this question was asked of previous speakers, but I think it's helpful to get each speaker's interpretation. Can wearing AirPods, or I think another kind of headphone, help, or does it hurt in the long term? Does it desensitize you, or does it overly sensitize you to additional sounds?
We're at 5 minutes.
I don't know the answer to this question, not having that particular background in audiology, but I was convinced by what the last speaker says, that I think if you do it too much, it's almost like your brain's going to think that you're going deaf, and it's going to try to increase its own kind of internal volume. And I think it could be somewhat detrimental to do that if you wear ear protections for too long. I suppose if you know you're encountering a trigger, then it might be entirely sensible to wear them at that point, because that is just a form of kind of aversion that, you're going to go to a place where somebody speaks with lip smacking, and I'm sorry that I did that a few times in my talk. It's like some people talk with a lip smack. That would be your coping strategy for that particular situation. But I would worry that long term wearing might have unintended consequences.
That seems to be a common sentiment. Speaking a little bit more to the treatment piece, and I know we have many more talks later today focused on what you can do for misophonia. Here's a question: if misophonia is classified as a psychological disorder, which is not currently, do you feel that treatment paths would be more accessible for individual sufferers? This relates to the point made with testing being just testing for response to sounds, not the severity of the sounds. Severity seems significant as someone with misophonia. For this person, severity is the important levels of fight or flight.
I don't doubt for a minute that the misophonia is in the brain at some level, and the question is how it got into the brain, and as well as how you might get it out. So I think calling it a neurological disorder isn't necessarily the right way of doing it. All of our brains are wired differently, and I would think that the brains of people with misophonia are wired differently. That doesn't necessarily make it a disorder. What makes it a disorder is the disruption it gives to your daily life. The way that I would think about this is that misophonia is there are multiple parts of the jigsaw, one of which would be a broad sensory sensitivity that is probably dispositional. It is something that you're born with, it's in your genes, it's in your brain, and that some people, for whatever reason, will magnify this tendency more than others, and that this would be another kind of transition point. So what it is that you're treating, I suppose, is, if you think about, well, all sounds are a bit aversive, there are some that are really aversive, and those are the ones you're going to want to treat, not all the sounds in the world. So although my research suggests that, all sounds are to some extent aversive, I'm not suggesting that that is the treatment strategy. It is about wanting to go out for dinner with your family and things like this. These are the things that are probably the targets of treatment. But I don't necessarily think that that is the cause of misophonia, is your family dynamics or something like this that's brought this on.
Lots more work to be done, enough to keep you busy. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. We're going to wrap up.
Thanks for your questions.
And turn to the next section. Thank you, Dr. Ward. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.